All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Oh, come on, people. You're in the room with me. Jeez. Make a guy feel welcome around here. Well, it's good to have all of you here. It's really our privilege to host this preview of the methodology today. I just wanted to provide some context to the conversation you're going to be a part of today, because I think it's a little bit of an extraordinary step that we're taking, at least if I could say that, if I could say so myself, because of the level of input that we had. Most of you would recall, and I imagine all of you recall, that we had our regional council approve the circulation of 3 options for the methodology, and we did that with an extensive amount of public participation. You will hear in a little bit how extensive that was and how much input we got. To the extent that we got a lot of input, and to the extent that the input was pushing away from the 3 options that we submitted, we felt it necessary to come back to everybody to share some thoughts of what we are anticipating will be part of what the staff recommendation is going to be to our subcommittee and ultimately approved by, if found worthy, approved by the regional council. And so rather than just show up at the regional council or the subcommittee with a staff report and a set of recommended methodology, we wanted to take the time to share with you how we've been guided by the input that we've gotten so far. And so you get a sense of where staff might end up in terms of methodology. And as a matter of fact, hopefully hear from you as well. We've heard a lot. I don't know that we could stop hearing from you because this is of grave importance to everybody. And that sort of lets me segue into one of the things that I have come to find about this conversation about housing. Ordinarily, SCAG does the RHNA process once every 8 years, and then we'll go away into hibernation on housing, and then come back the next 8 years and do it again. This time is a little different. We are, in fact, staying with housing because housing has become, for better or for worse, an existential issue for us in this region. We are mostly a transportation planning agency, but we have a housing portfolio under state law with RHNA. Beyond the RHNA process, with the governor's approval of AB 101, we find ourselves beginning to get recognized to do more work in housing. And so even before that, we had been talking about this concept of beyond RHNA, and what that really means is how SCAG can be effective in helping our jurisdictions actually build houses, because we're finding out that given the crisis that we have in terms of affordability, with attendant homelessness issues, there's all of these things that are piled on that are housing related, that we could not function as a region going forward if we don't solve the housing crisis. And it takes all of us to solve it, not one city by itself, but every one of our jurisdictions, 197 of you and SCAG together. And SCAG could play a role. And so we're trying to figure out what that role will be, and you will see some discussions at our CHD committee conversations and ultimately at the regional council as well as to what that will be. Our conversation today is going to be based on the regional determination that we have so far gotten from HCD, the Housing Community Development Department at the state, which is 1.34470740. I think that's a number. I remember that number because I see it in my dreams anymore. It's 1,344,740 is the regional determination that we have. We're assuming that is still our regional determination. And for the record, we officially filed an objection to the regional determination based on process, not necessarily dealing with the numbers, but we were required as a matter of that filing to also provide a number. And so that's been sent in to HCD. So that's the context in which we find ourselves today. You will hear conversations about what the public input process, the quality of the public input process has been, what we got back, and the sense of the discussion that we've gotten so far. You will hear then about where the methodology is headed. I think there was a heavy weighting in the input, as I can tell, and this is spoiler alert. I think there was a lot of concern about making sure that we match housing with jobs and also with our transit and transportation investments, where you have investments already, which makes sense because that's the essence of our regional planning process, and our Connect SoCal is already tacking along those lines. So we find that to be consistent with our regional planning basis. And so I don't want to take too much time, and I just hope that we have a vigorous conversation today. My hope is that we're not fighting over numbers, that we're actually thinking about how we build houses ultimately. Whatever we do at 1.34 million, every jurisdiction is going to get more numbers than they were planning for, or that they think they can handle. That's just the bottom line. We can't hide the number. And so what we're trying to do with a methodology is to find the most effective way and the fairest way to parse the numbers out, divvy out the numbers to all of our jurisdictions, such that it's consistent with our sustainability goals and ultimately leads to housing construction. And so that's really the charge that we have at SCAG, and we hope that you join us in that effort, and we are looking forward to hearing from you. And with that, I'm going to introduce Mayan Johnson. She is in the eye of the storm on this, and she'll walk you through some of the presentation. And then I believe Kevin is going to join you at some point as well. All right, you guys have fun.
Great. Thank you, Kome. I've probably already talked to many of you in person or by email, but I'm Mayan Johnson. I run the RHNA hotline, and I will be helping today to present on the big reveal, what SCAG staff recommends for the RHNA allocation, the draft RHNA allocation methodology. So just as an overview, you just heard Kome go over today's welcome. So I'll be presenting on the framework of our staff recommended draft RHNA methodology. And then we'll have some time for questions, both here in Los Angeles office, our video conference locations, and those who are webcasting. You'll be able to ask questions if you send an email to housing@scag.ca.gov. After questions, we'll also set aside some time for comments, but those comments will be limited to the SCAG offices and video conference sites. But of course, you can send comments again to housing@scag.ca.gov after today's workshop. So just setting where we are in the RHNA process, as Kome had mentioned, HCD gave us our regional determination last month, that 1.344 million number that covers the entire region. So today we're talking about the RHNA methodology, and we've been in the midst of this process, but the methodology is applied to that regional number to get your individual jurisdiction's draft allocation. We'll have an appeals process of the draft RHNA allocation next summer, and then in October of next year, we'll have the final RHNA allocation. So we have a little over a year to go before RHNA is complete. So we're just starting, basically. Your housing element for the 6th cycle will be due to HCD in October 2021, and that covers October 2021 through October 2029. So the regional determination for the 6th cycle is 1,344,740 units for the region. While SCAG staff, we submitted an objection per our regional council action earlier this month to HCD. We are still waiting for their response. But the regional determination represents both existing and projected need for the SCAG region. So the purpose of the methodology is how do we distribute this 1.34 million number so every jurisdiction gets an individual allocation.
Just a quick question.
Oh, your mic.
Okay, taking a look at that 1.344740, are you thinking, oh, for sure they're going to go ahead and give us less, or no, they probably won't give us less? When you appeal something, is this something that automatically happens, or they just tell you to pound sand, or what is this?
I think it's all of the above. I mean,
Okay.
it's at their discretion.
Okay.
We're hoping that they will have a good basis. We did not contest the number just on a flimsy basis. We contested the numbers on very plain procedural basis, and so we're hoping that they address that. And HCD has been very, just to be clear, they have been very cooperative and even magnanimous in their dealings with us on this issue, and we were learning together. And I think they're honest about what they're trying to do. I mean, there are some issues with how we engage earlier on, and that hopefully is behind us. So we're hopeful that they will take seriously what we presented to them and come back with a revision, possibly. I would argue that the revision is probably not going to be too far from what they already gave us, if it comes down at all. I mean, I think the bottom line is we know the number is not going to go up, or we hope it's not going to go up. But the revision, given the points that we've made, I would expect that would only serve to be slightly different than what they already gave us. So it's going to still be close to, it's going to be well over $1 million.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right, so the methodology process. Many of you have already submitted public comments on the proposed methodology process. The public comment period had ended on September 13th, so a couple weeks ago. But throughout the month of August, SCAG staff had 4 public hearings held throughout the SCAG region, and we also had an additional public information session on the proposed methodology. There's 3 options proposed, and received a lot of comments on the different components, on alternative methods to distribute that 1.34 million, but it was a very extensive public outreach and comment review period. So right now we're starting to enter the draft RHNA methodology process. So out of those 3 options, SCAG staff in the next few slides I'll present on what our recommended draft methodology is. But we can only submit one option or one methodology to HCD, but these need to further the objectives of state housing law and our regional goals. So the draft RHNA methodology, that will be reviewed on October 7th by the RHNA subcommittee. Then on October 21st, there's a special CEHD committee meeting based on the recommendation of the RHNA subcommittee. And then on November 7th, the regional council is expected to take action, and then we'll take that draft methodology from the November 7th meeting and submit that to HCD for their review. They'll have a 60-day review of the draft RHNA methodology, and they'll provide comments to us. And then the final RHNA methodology, SCAG staff will review all the comments from HCD and then make a recommendation, and then it'll go again before the RHNA subcommittee, CEHD Policy Committee, and then our regional council. So this is definitely not the end of the process. This is just the start of the draft RHNA methodology. So as a reminder, the objectives of RHNA are regional allocation plan. That's a result of the methodology and the appeals process have to further these 5 objectives of state housing law. One is to increase housing supply and mix of housing types. The second is to promote infill development and socioeconomic equity and the protection of open space and the encouragement of efficient development patterns. The next is to promote and improve intra-regional relationship between jobs and housing. Next is to ensure that there's not an over-concentration of income groups where they already exist. So we want to avoid giving more of the same. And then finally, we also want to affirmatively furthering fair housing, AFFH. This is based on the HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development definition, in which we have to ensure that we're not perpetuating historical segregation patterns based on protected classes, and also increasing access to fair housing. So I won't get too much detail into the three options that were part of the public comment period for the proposed methodology. But the three options were developed based on feedback from the RHNA subcommittee and stakeholders, and they applied different components and different formulas on a RHNA methodology. So stakeholders were invited to provide comments on any of the three options, their components, or any other alternative options. So the public review and comment period was from August 1st to September 13th, and we held 4 public hearings and an information session in August. About 250 people attended these 5 different types of events, both in person and via webcast, and over 35 verbal comments were shared at these hearings and the session. Almost 250 comments were received specifically on the RHNA methodology by the September 13th deadline, and about half were directly from jurisdictions and subregions. The other half came from advocacy and industry organizations, residents and resident groups, and the general public. This is actually a marked departure from the 4th and 5th cycles, in which it was just mostly jurisdictions. So we're certainly happy to have a lot more stakeholders involved for the 6th cycle process. All written comments have been reviewed by SCAG staff and to help develop our proposed draft methodology. But if you wanted to view them as well, you can view them on our SCAG RHNA webpage at www.scag.ca.gov/RHNA. So for these next 2 slides, I'd just like to briefly turn it over to my colleague, Kevin Kane.
Hey, I'm Kevin Kane, SCAG Staff in Research and Analysis. You probably know me by now from various RHNA presentations as well. I wanted to kind of give a little bit of a context and overview. I work principally on the regional determination and regional level demographic drivers and such. But planning for this volume of existing housing need, the way it's been defined by HCD, is certainly an unprecedented challenge, which, as Kome mentioned, really requires cooperation from all local jurisdictions on a lot of these factors and an understanding of what's going into this methodology. What do we do? What's our approach when we have this unprecedented challenge? Well, it's largely to build upon our core practice. So the starting point in this staff recommended RHNA methodology is going to start by looking at our RTPSCS, Regional Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy. We are calling it Connect SoCal for this cycle. So the starting point is to look at Connect SoCal's jurisdictional level growth forecast for the RHNA period from 2021 to 2029, with a couple of minor adjustments that you'll see that are reminiscent of the old, one of the options, the original option 1. Just small adjustments essentially based on replacement need and vacancy, which have been pretty well established. This really is important to ensure that Connect SoCal's goals, which relate to things like priority growth areas, constraint areas, wildfire risk areas, things like that, in addition to equity, transportation investment, and all these other environmental benefits and those types of things, extend from our core practice into the RHNA methodology. So the proposal here is such that no jurisdiction's housing unit total is lower than this amount. Beyond that, though, we have this existing need category. So our staff recommendation here is, again, to start, at least as a starting point, to follow the forecasted growth for 2045 from Connect SoCal, with adjustments to further some of these objectives, which are common both to the plan and to state housing law. So these adjustments, as Mayan will go into a little bit more detail in, include assigning units based on a jurisdiction's level of access to jobs and level of access to transit. So because of this volume of existing housing need that is our task to assign right now, some jurisdictions' housing unit totals necessarily will exceed the 2045 household forecast from Connect SoCal. It's just that big of a number in large part. And assigning housing need above this number was done on the basis of 3 things. First, a jurisdiction's level of access to jobs, a jurisdiction's level of access to transit, as we already discussed. However, jurisdictions with high levels of segregation, poverty, and low resource levels, this is a data point that we'll be introducing just in a moment, will not exceed their 2045 growth totals. So essentially, based on resource levels, as defined by a state data set that we're employing for this purpose, will allow you to cap those jurisdictions at the 2045 levels. So in terms of allocating this, not only just the number of units, but across income categories, as you know from Mayan's previous presentations and ours as well, that the actual number from the state is split across 4 income categories: very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. And based on that goal of RHNA, such as to not overburden jurisdictions with more of the same, Our core principle for this is to allocate across these categories based on household incomes. So essentially, if you are higher than your county in household income, you get a little bit higher of a share of the very low and low income housing. We've made a slight modification to this that only applies to the 30-some highest and lowest resourced jurisdictions based on that same state-based data set I referenced that will increase this adjustment a little bit. So if you're particularly high or particularly low, it expands this, what we call social equity adjustment, just slightly. And that's kind of the core principle that we're following to meet these not only social equity goals, but affirmatively furthering fair housing goals set forth by the state. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mayan for a little bit more detailed dive into some of these data points.
Thank you, Heaven, for presenting on our overall approach. So the next slides will then go over, so how does this play out in the methodology formulas? So many of you are probably familiar with the three options, but the draft methodology that we're recommending is based heavily on how option one separated out projected and existing needs. So we're going to have two different approaches on how SCAG at the regional level provides or determines a jurisdiction's projected and existing housing needs. So once these are combined, that's what makes up a total RHNA allocation. So this is very similar to option one's projected housing need, but the largest share of a jurisdiction's projected housing need will be based on its share of regional projected household growth. So this is then the largest portion of projected housing need, and then it's slightly modified. So you have other factors such as future vacancy need by owner and renter, and then a share of regional replacement need added on top of that. So these three are added together to get the jurisdiction's projected housing need. The next step is determining existing housing need. So SCAG staff, we received a lot of comments from our jurisdictions, stakeholders, and the general public on different factors that should be applied to existing housing need. The largest one that we received an overwhelming number of comments on is job accessibility. So that objective of tying jobs to housing, that intra-regional relationship. This is actually something that SCAG looked at, and I'll go over in the next few slides exactly the mechanism for this, but we did review every single comment, and that was one of the most overwhelming responses we received, is to tie job accessibility to RHNA allocation. So that will make up 25% of the regional existing need. That'll be assigned based on a jurisdiction share of job accessibility. The other 25% will be share of population within high quality transit areas, or HQTAs. HQTAs are defined as areas that have 15 or more minute headways for bus services at peak hours, and they also include commuter rail stations. One change for the HQTA definition is we've expanded it, also based on comments, so that it's not just based on current HQTA areas, but also for planned. So those up until 2045, we're including this in this 25% of existing need for the region. 50% will be based on household growth between 2030 and 2045. One of the main reasons for this is to then match job accessibility, which goes until 2045, and also the population within HQTAs to 2045. This supports the planned infrastructure and amenities to support the two other factors. So this will be the regional existing need in our proposed draft methodology. So a jurisdiction's existing need will be based on its share of household growth, transit accessibility, and its share of job accessibility. So the summary of changes are that we've added the job accessibility factor. We've also added household growth between 2030 and 2045, but we removed existing population, in which the prior proposed methodology of option one had included. But option one also included permit activities. So jurisdictions with an undersupply, they have not permitted enough units to keep up with their population growth over the past two RHNA cycles. That factor has been removed. The primary reason for this is because the source of this data, SCAG staff and several comments had pointed out that there were some inaccuracies in that data. So in some cases, it may have been underreported or overreported. So in the interest of fairness, transparency, and accuracy, SCAG staff has recommended to remove permit activity from determining existing need at the regional level. And then the other change is transit accessibility is now based on planned or 2045 HQTA areas. So job accessibility. There's 1,000,001 ways to do RHNA, and there's also 1,000,001 ways to determine job accessibility. One way is to determine a jobs and housing ratio for every jurisdiction, and then base every share of this factor based on that ratio for jurisdictions. But determining that ratio, what's appropriate for each individual jurisdiction, you can actually spend years determining that. People do PhD dissertations on this. So rather than go through that angle, SCAG staff actually looked at job accessibility through the share of regional jobs accessible within a 30-minute drive commute. So the red areas, the red and orange areas, are areas that have the highest share of job accessibility by that definition of the 30-minute drive commute in the region. So those jurisdictions will receive a higher share of job accessibility than the more outlying areas and the yellow and blue shaded areas. So that's how job accessibility is defined in this proposed draft methodology. So the next step, as my colleague Kevin had mentioned, that there is actually a residual existing need. So let's say for this example, a typical city A, we determine its calculated existing need based on the formula I described earlier. The residual need, a lot of jurisdictions exceeded the housing unit need based on the 2020 to 2045 Connect SoCal household growth. In that case, there's a residual. So that's a difference between its calculated existing need and its housing unit need as defined by our plan. So not every jurisdiction has this residual need, but there are a large number of jurisdictions that do. So that's about 20% of the regional existing need is considered residual. So we add these all together to get a regional residual existing need. The next step is determining how do you distribute this regional residual need. So to further the objectives of state housing law, particularly for jobs housing relationship and also for better and efficient development patterns related to transit, we actually combined these two objectives to determine areas with both the highest job accessibility and areas with the highest transit accessibility. But then there's also some concern. Several letters pointed out that there are extremely disadvantaged communities that are just getting more of the same. So those are actually excluded from that. So you can see the shaded areas are areas with the highest job accessibility and the highest transit accessibility, but we've excluded the extremely disadvantaged communities. So we total these two together, a jurisdiction's existing need based on household growth share, transit accessibility, and job accessibility, and for certain jurisdictions receiving a residual existing need, and then the projected need based on regional projected household growth, future vacancy need, and share of regional replacement need. That's how you get a jurisdiction's total RHNA allocation. So the final step is social equity adjustment. Many of you are familiar with how this works, but in case you've forgotten already, what you can do is you take a jurisdiction's current existing household need distribution by income category. So in this slide, the city A, everyone's favorite city, currently it has 36% of its existing households are considered very low income. So its county is 25%. So that means it has a high concentration of very low income households in comparison to its county. So to avoid just giving it more of the same, because if we just assigned it based on existing need, you would end up with higher concentration of low income households because that's what's existing now. So in this case, let's say you take 100% social equity adjustment. That means it matches to the county. So City A would drop from 36% of its RHNA having to be very low income households, it would drop to 25%. So that's at 100% social equity adjustment. It matches the county. 110% means it goes towards the county distribution and then give or take about 10% of that difference. So 110% means it goes beyond the county. So it dropped to 24%. If it was even more progressive, the higher percentage, the more progressive it is. So if it's 175%, that means that 17% of its total RHNA would be for very low income households. This is in contrast to its current existing distribution of 36%. And then the opposite happens for above moderate. It would jump from 32% to 45% for 110% social equity adjustment. And then it would be 53% if it was 175% social equity adjustment. So the higher the number, the more progressive changes you'll see. So there's more shifting around by income category, particularly where jurisdictions that have an over-concentration as it is right now. So based on a lot of comments we received, a lot of stakeholders were concerned that household income should not be the only factor in determining where these areas are, particularly with the new goal of affirmatively furthering fair housing, to reduce or mitigate a lot of historical patterns of segregation that we've seen throughout the SCAG region. So opportunity indices, these are developed by the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee, also known as TCAC. They created a tool known as opportunity indices. These areas identify communities that have low, moderate, and high level of resources. These resources include indicators such as health and environment, math and reading proficiency, education levels, low-wage job proximity, poverty rates, and educational attainment. If you are viewing today and you want to actually see right now their methodology, just Google TCAC opportunity indices and you can see the methodology directly. But these go beyond just using household income as an indicator to determine social equity adjustments. So building these in, because RHNA does need to be separated into 4 income categories. So very low is 50% or less of county median income, low is 50 to 80%, moderate is 80 to 120%, and above moderate is 120% and above. So how do you build in this type of factor? So SCAG recommends that areas with the highest concentration of resource areas will receive an additional social equity adjustment. So you can have areas that have 100%, 100% of their population is considered as a high resource area according to the TCAC indices. Other areas are, for example, 90% low resource areas. So you'll see a range throughout our region. So areas that are between 70 and 100% will receive an additional factor. So these identify areas with either very low resources, a high concentration of very low resources, or areas that have a high concentration of high resources. So it's a gradient scale that we're recommending, but between 70 and 80% of this concentration, we recommend a 10% additional social equity adjustment. Between 80 and 90%, about 20%, and 90% to 100% of concentration, we recommend an additional social equity adjustment of 30%. So these are just areas that are identified as having the highest concentration of either poverty and low resource areas or areas with a high amount of resources. So SCAG staff recommends 150% minimum social equity adjustment, and then for areas with a high concentration are added up to 30% for these areas. So a total social equity adjustment would be between 150% to 180%. So once you get the social equity adjustment, this is applied to the total RHNA allocation to get the 4 RHNA income categories. So to recap, the staff recommended draft RHNA methodology. Its existing need will be based on household growth between 2030 and 2045, transit accessibility based on HUTA population of 2045, job accessibility, and then there's also, for some jurisdictions, residual distribution beyond 2020 to 2045 household growth. Projected need will be based on household growth between 2020 and 2030. There'll also be a future vacancy need and a replacement need added to that. And then income categories will be based on 150% social equity adjustment as a minimum, and then up to 30% additional adjustment for areas with either the lowest concentration or highest concentration of resource areas. So based on an analysis of all these factors and reviewing all of the comments that were submitted on the proposed methodology, SCAG staff has determined that all 5 of the RHNA objectives have been furthered through different components in our draft methodology. So the next steps. So today is just, we're going to go over questions and also take any comments today. But the next step is on October 7th at 10 a.m. We'll have our RHNA subcommittee meeting, and the agenda and updated tool will be posted early next week. And there'll also be video conferencing and view-only webcasting available for that meeting. On October 21st, we'll have a special CEHD committee meeting, also at 10 a.m., to then go over the recommendation of the October 7th RHNA subcommittee meeting. November 7th, we'll have our regional council meeting at 12:15 p.m., and they'll also then consider the recommendation of the CEHD committee. After the regional council action, SCAG staff will send the draft methodology to HCD for their 60-day review, and then we'll bring it back to, again, the RHNA subcommittee, CEHD committee, and the regional council early next year, then to adopt the final RHNA methodology. So as I said before, we are just getting started, and we look forward to any questions that you have today. And also to note, right after today's workshop, we'll also post this presentation. So if your pictures come out blurry, you can also view them online. Thank you.
Hi, good morning again. I'm Pinch and Manager in Compliance and Performance Monitoring. So I will basically moderate this Q&A session. And at the beginning, I'd just like to add to Komi's welcome that right now, I think we actually have 179 people, I think, on the web. So I'd like to thank all of them, and not only your interest, but also certainly further the regional goal to reduce the VMT. And so we just heard, I think, from staff in terms of the what and why of the staff proposal. So I think one quick question, I think before you ask staff the question is, if your city council member asks you is, what is the SCAG staff proposal? If you would have only like no more than like 4 words, I think what would you say? And so my suggestion is you could respond by saying it is a hybrid plus more. It is hybrid because it takes the element from each of the 3 options, and then with additional enhancement. And I think certainly the enhancement, I think the job accessibility, the AFFH, and also I think to have a cap on the 2045, the Connect SoCal, the growth forecast. So those are the enhancements. So I hope your answer would be, not only is an enhanced hybrid, but hopefully it's, from our standpoint, a significantly enhanced hybrid. Okay, so I think with that, let's start with, I think, your questions. So I would suggest what we would do, and we would start from the LA office, and then we will go with the video conferencing sites. And then after that, since we have 179 people on the web, we do want to provide you also the opportunity. So please email your questions to housing@scag.ca.gov. And then so we will try to select some of your questions, not asked, I think, by the previous 2 groups. I hope that would work for everybody. So with that, we will basically start from the LA office. I just want to stress this is the portion of questions, because our foremost objective is to make sure that this is informative, make sure that you understand what is the staff proposal. So with that, Duan, if you can each just briefly mention your name as well as your affiliation.
Sure, Dwayne Baker with San Bernardino Council of Governments and Transportation Authority. And actually, the question I have is, will you update the tool that you had, the calculator? Because that was very helpful, especially when dealing with our member agencies, to see how this allocation would work. So will that be updated, and when?
Yes, we'll have the tool to accompany the distribution and release of the RHNA subcommittee agenda, so early next week. We'll also blanket everyone when that's posted.
Gail.
Thank you, Ping. Gail Shiomoto-Lore, representing the City of Mission Viejo. I have 2 questions. The first is the slide presentation identified the use of the opportunity indices for the new RHNA methodology, and you identified the 5 factors that would be involved. I'm just trying to recollect, is that information currently available if a jurisdiction wanted to know how it fell within each of the indices? Is it in the current appendix for the RHNA methodology? And if so, could you sort of direct us? That's the first one.
Sure, Gail, thanks for that question. The AFFH or TCAC, I guess opportunity indicators is a good way to probably characterize these. This is from a state treasurer's office and HCD collaborative work, and it takes all of those data points that Maya mentioned, things like school quality, poverty, education level, environmental quality, whatever, and puts them into a census tract level or a neighborhood level measure for us. So we here at SCAG take that neighborhood level measure and then use a population basis to scale that up to the jurisdictional level. So essentially what we end up with is across 5 categories, essentially summarized as very low resource, moderate resource, high resource, and very high resource. We have, for each jurisdiction, it sums to 100%. So you have essentially a percentage at each of those categories. Is what we end up working with. So there is an internal data step here. We have to convert this from a kind of a neighborhood level measure to a jurisdictional level measure in order to use it for RHNA, because of course RHNA only operates at the jurisdictional level. So some of those details will be provided when it is released in the tool for sure, as we mentioned early next week. And I imagine in the narrative version, the more formal narrative version as well.
And the jurisdiction will be rated on each one of the 5 categories, and then there will be an average or a summation if you have some, but you don't have others.
Well, the intent is to make it very similar to how the income distribution works. Essentially, for the social equity adjustment as is, and in the presented options, you can see this in the tool fairly nicely, is that each city has a population at very low, moderate, and above moderate income levels. And if you add those 4 up, it sums to 100% for each city. This has the exact same intuition. We've taken this measure that the state has developed and adapted it for the use at the jurisdictional level, so that across those 5 resource level categories, it sums to 100% for each jurisdiction.
Thank you, Kevin. The second question, I'm sorry, the second question.
Okay, could you hold
Sure.
that? Okay. That's just try to get as many as possible, if that would be okay with you. And Ben, yes.
Hi, good morning. Ben Winter from the City of Los Angeles, Office of Mayor Eric Garcetti. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you to the SCAG staff. I think this process really did demonstrate that you took the public input process very seriously and are putting forward some alternative models that balance multiple goals and objectives. I do have one question about local input process, though. Are you still proposing to have a local input process in this proposed determination? And if so, how can you ensure that that process does not result in some cities rejecting their fair share of housing?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for that question. That's a good point. So, our planning practice here at SCAG relies particularly heavily on understanding the land use characteristics and distribution currently and in the future for all 197 local jurisdictions here. That really forms the core of our growth forecast. It is fundamentally SCAG's growth forecast, even at the small area level. We have a local input process to solicit input, because local jurisdictions know a lot more about the small characteristics, and we attempt as best as possible to put that into our data set for the Connect SoCal growth forecast. So there is local input in the Connect SoCal growth forecast. It's an inherent part of planning at a regional agency. And there are many places in this methodology where that is reflected. And that is particularly important because of the goals between the Connect SoCal process and the RHNA process that are shared in common, things like priority growth areas, constraint areas, transportation, equity, environmental benefits, what have you. So there are elements of that sprinkled throughout here. We have, in addition to local input, we've added these the job accessibility and transit measures in particular, which are above and beyond Connect SoCal's growth forecast. So those are the places where it's most clearly reflected that there are additional elements for allocating units. Did you want to add or?
Well, yeah, I just want to maybe clarify that I think there is I suspect in the conversations we've been having over the last few months that there is a misunderstanding of what local input is, what the local input process is. I think there's a sense that people just think it's some arbitrary number that we get from local jurisdictions. The local input process is actually grounded on a number of basic demographics, which is verified across what DOF puts out. It's based on census information, it's based on ACS information, but also it's a quality of information that we get from all of our jurisdictions on what the existing and planned land uses might be. We can't make any of that up for 191 cities and 6 counties. We have to rely on our jurisdictions because they're required by state mandate to also do good planning. And so rely on them for that source of information from their various general plans. So there is an amalgamation of a lot of sources that amounts to what is the base regional planning data that we work off of. And in fact, one of the cases we've made, or the strongest case we made to HCD, is that it's of importance that there is consistency in our regional planning bases across transportation and housing. While housing might, HCD might not be too familiar with jobs and employment and as an input, we look across those 3 big data points. Population, households, and employment. And so all of those 3 weigh in together to form the basis for our regional planning. And that's also essentially partly where local input comes in. So it's a very important element. We can't walk away from it because I know a lot of people have sort of talked about not using local input process, which just doesn't make any sense to us. But I understand it's because most people don't understand the basis of what the local input process is. We go through a 2-year process of solidifying our local input, and it just forms the basis for our regional planning, which is, again, the basis for all of our regional activities, including Clean Air Act conformity activities. So we're relying on it for a lot of things, and it just makes sense that it also becomes a foundational element of our housing planning.
Thanks, Kwame. If I may, just to add, I think the intent of the state housing law is really to consider both the local planning factors and the regional planning factors. So what staff is proposing in terms of, for example, job accessibility, transit accessibility, those are the regional planning factors. And then in terms of the household growth, that I think has probably a little bit more orient to the local planning factors, because a lot of the localized factors that is in a way considered, I think, in that. So we are really trying very hard, I think, to kind of balance those. With that, I think, Pavel.
Yeah, it's a good segue. That's what I wanted to have a question and a comment masked as a question. I guess the question is, will you do any regional analysis of this proposed method? Because the way I see it, I mean, if you wanted a quick summary of the way I look at this proposal, it's 2/3 local factors and 1/3 regional factors, right? And I think the problem with the SCAG region is that the local factors run in the opposite direction of the regional planning goals of sustainability, infill, all these other things, right? So if we look at the 2/3, which is, projected household growth, the places where those numbers will be higher are the places without jobs, the places with lower incomes, the places farther out. So I think as a whole, this is going to be, again, working as in previous cycles against kind of sustainability and affordability goals. I think especially, so the question is, will you do a regional analysis of what this will lead to in terms of numbers? The second question is, do you really think, so if we can look at that chart or remind ourselves of the 5 statutory mandates of the law and then how different elements of this proposal meet those statutory mandates. The one where it says, sorry, is this too long of a comment already? It's important. It is. It was near the end. Right, so there's the one where it's one of the mandates is increased supply. And this is where you justify using local factors. So 2/3 of the proposal here is using local factors, and that's justified by increasing supply as the mandate. But in this technical note I submitted, I've showed that places where there is a lot of capacity are the places where we're not building, and places where there's less capacity are actually the places where we are building in the region. And that's because the more expensive cities are the ones with less capacity, but they're also more expensive, so that's where things get built. So actually, I don't think that using local factors is going to satisfy the increasing supply mandate of the law. So I guess how do you really think it will, and kind of how are you going to justify that? Because I don't think it would stand up in a court.
Well, we think it can stand up. I mean, obviously, we wouldn't be proposing if we didn't think it was going to be sustained. I think it also, you have to keep in mind that, I'm not sure if your 2/3, 1/3 make clear sense to me. I'm not seeing that.
Well, the projected needs about 450. And then you're splitting half of the existing need, which is about 900. Half of it's going based on, so that's 450 and 450 is 900. So 900 out of the 1.3 is basically just projected growth.
Well, but you have to also keep in mind that you're basing where you're basing things off of the household needs. That's across the board, so it includes all cities. So it's not, and to the extent that you have large cities and more coastal cities involved, there's also weighting towards those cities in essence. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily negative. I think we have to tack to something real. And so where we get into trouble is if we start to devise concepts that we can't fully grounded at this point in the conversation. I think we run the risk of not being able to defend it fully, but being able to tack to something real like household growth, which is going to affect every single community. But more so if you're talking about weighting it weighted more towards the communities that you're talking about that should be weighted towards. And of course, with the additional level of job access and transit access, I think you're conditioning to have growth where it's consistent with what our regional planning basis is. So I feel comfortable with that. I'm not so sure that I would buy into the fact that we might be working at cross purposes.
But if I can, I mean, we could look at the data and see that it is in fact working at cross purposes. Would you change your mind then?
Yeah, let me see the data.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, Marika.
Marika Pointer with the City of Irvine. Are you going to be providing additional information on how the jobs accessibility is developed? Is it related to, Kevin, your presentation on the job centers that we've seen before and how that's going to be distributed? And I'll just bring it up. I've brought up the concern before with the 2 job centers that have been identified in your document, mainly the Irvine Business Complex. There are places that are closer to live in Costa Mesa and Newport Beach than actually portions that are developing in the city of Irvine. It's far more sustainable. It's a closer drive. Santa Ana too, you're talking about 5-minute commutes versus 25 to 30-minute commutes from the other side of the valley essentially. So I'm wondering if there will be more detailed explanation on how that's going to play out, just to make sure there is some equity in that. And again, our concern is we have those 2 job centers that are very close together, but also bordering quite a lot of jurisdictions in Orange County as well with connectivity.
I can take that one. And Marika, thanks very much for your question. Do you think you can go back to the map slide?
Sure.
Perhaps on there, because that illustrates it really nicely. I think you referenced Job Center's presentation earlier. That's kind of one of the components of Connect SoCal is to identify regional job centers and have a few growth-based strategies in them in particular. RHNA is a slightly different process in that it only actually exists at the jurisdictional level. So we don't really feel that using the same job center geographies are appropriate for the RHNA process. Instead, what you have here in the chloropleth map format here going from the blue to the red is a measure of job access that actually comes out of our activity-based transportation model that's used for the regional plan. And essentially what this is it starts at the TAZ transportation analysis zone level and generates a number of what percentage of regional jobs can you actually get to from this particular location. And that's based on the kind of overall premise that doesn't really, as you mentioned, respect jurisdictional boundaries of how close are jobs or how close is the bulk of jobs to a particular location. We've essentially scaled that up to the jurisdictional level, so each jurisdiction gets essentially a score of what is the typical census, what is the typical TAS in this jurisdiction, and how many jobs can you access from there. And that forms the main basis for the job accessibility measure. Once the tool is released, you'll have the underlying data in there in a similar format to the previous tool. So that'll allow for a little bit of additional analysis. And there will be certainly, this is kind of the, the narrative slide deck preview. You'll have more technical detail provided in there. But hopefully that kind of gives an overall view of what this is. Any other follow-ups or? Cool.
Yeah, so for the job accessibility, why 30 minutes?
So 30 minutes, we don't have it necessarily an extremely crisp answer for a lot of these accessibility related measures. My understanding of literature, whether it's walking distances or biking distances or driving distances, there's a particularly wide range. There aren't, especially crisp, industry standards, so to speak, for how far folks are willing to walk or to drive or what have you. Given the urban geography of Southern California, given the spatial pattern of the 197 local jurisdictions here, we felt this gave a pretty good sense of, of accessibility within, what's certainly perhaps a reasonable commute. It's fairly close, from my understanding, to average commute times in the region. And as you can see from the map, it's a fairly good reflection of just where kind of common understanding of jobs density is.
Okay, so let's go to the video conferencing sites right now, and let's see. Any question from the Orange County? Okay, any questions from the Palmdale site?
No, not at this time.
Okay, any questions from Imperial office?
None, thank you, Pink.
Okay, any questions from the CVAC office?
None at this time.
Okay. Any questions from the Ventura office?
No.
Okay. Any questions from the Riverside office?
No questions.
Okay. And any questions from the San Bernardino office?
Yes, Ping. This is Josh from SBCT. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Just in regards to the projected need, I'm seeing that the split still stays, and then the jobs housing factor only applies to existing need. Is there any reason why staff felt the projected need doesn't need to account for job housing balance?
Okay, so I think on this one, we actually do have a statutory requirement as to the consistency, I think, between RHNA and the SCS and the projecting needs portion of the SCS. So as, in order to meet that requirements, that I think we will need, I think, to use the Connect SoCal's goals forecast, I think, for the RHNA's projecting need portion. So I think that's kind of our perspective.
Okay, thank you. But I'll reserve my comments to the end. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. So with that, I think we will be back to the Los Angeles office and as to any questions that you might have. Okay, Gail, thanks for your patience.
No problem. Actually, Marika asked the initial one, but I did have a follow-up question for Kevin on the jobs housing. So again, you're looking at a 30-minute commute shed from each traffic analysis zone that is within a jurisdiction. And then how many jobs are accessible within that 30-minute commute shed? Do you then factor it against the number of houses or households within that TAS or within that jurisdiction? I mean, is there some balance so that, for example, maybe there's a lot of jobs that can be accessed within that jurisdiction, but if you also factored in the number of homes that are also within that jurisdiction, there's some type of parity or match. So I'm trying to see how you factor that, or if it's factored at all.
Yes, Gail. The answer to that is yes. There is a factor whereby it is population weighted, and that's essentially just to get a scale measure. You could have a jurisdiction that has incredible job access, but it's particularly small. Perhaps the example of West Hollywood or somewhere in this deep red here, but is a fairly small jurisdiction. You know, that's not going to get a 10 times as many houses as it has quarter-acre lots or something to that effect. So it is weighted in that sense.
Is the calculator, does the calculator identify the factor so you can actually, see it?
Yes, it will.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, any other question? Matt?
Hi, Matt Glessney, City Planning, Los Angeles. Just on that same transportation measure, wondering why we looked at just auto and not all types of commute. We're trying to get folks out of the car. Just wondering why we didn't look at the way number of jobs available through all means.
For sure, I'm definitely with you here on that one and in the overall thrust of it. Given that the way we actually ended up allocating percentage shares, roughly half on job accessibility overall, roughly half on the high quality transit area, we feel that's fairly well captured in the HQTA component. This is, given how our activity-based transportation model works, this is an output that's very robust, very readily available to adapt for this purpose as well. So we feel it's strong in that regard, and generally distances do tend to mirror across modes to some extent, but overall we do feel that the transit component's pretty adequately captured in the HQTA as well.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I just actually had a quick one about the HQTA. I know in some of the public comments, they mentioned using share of land within an HQTA instead of share of population, with the idea that if there's already housing near the transit, that's not where we need to be pressuring places to build. Did you consider that as a modification to the way you incorporate HQTA into the calculation?
As you'll see once we kind of have the more comprehensive documentation and tool available, the main revision that we made to HQTAs was to use 2045 HQTAs. So essentially, we're doing it based on where future transit accessibility and where future projected population in that transit accessible area is. So it's still population based, but it's all 2045 based. So I guess partial yes.
Why? I mean, what's the logic behind that versus just using how much land is within a half mile of transit?
In part, when you're delineating a high quality transit area, when you're delineating a piece of land or a map of land, you have to scale it by some sort of magnitude. And in particular, there are a lot of other considerations such as constraint areas, such as environmental quality, issues, what have you, whereby just the acres of land. Certainly some measure of urbanized land area or some more nuanced approach could potentially be used to sharpen slightly. We did a fair bit of kind of in-house analysis on various options to that effect. The ultimate outcome of that is that this is a fairly reasonable reflection overall. We're happy to discuss a little bit more offline perhaps, but overall those were considered here and there. But ultimately, this accomplishes what we're seeking to accomplish from it.
Okay, we have two more questions from the web.
Hi. So has SCAG explored VMT in addition to the 30-minute transit time for job accessibility? That's question one.
Oh, that's me? Okay. Not specifically. This is essentially a mechanism to say, hey, this is a piece of land here where, how accessible are jobs to it? That's definitely one element that's captured in the Connect SoCal plan overall.
Well, and I think to that point, that's the essence of tacking this to Connect SoCal. The intent of looking at transit access and job access is to actually reduce VMT so that we meet one of our larger objectives in regional planning, which is reduction in GHG.
And question number two, for the job housing balance, does job quality get taken into account?
We're not explicitly taking into account a measure of job quality, job level, what have you. This is overall jobs that are taken into account in this measure. There are some points in the TCAC measure, which is the state measure that we're using in, I would say, in a limited capacity to improve the social equity adjustment and to create a floor to ensure that the lower resource jurisdictions, have an easier time planning for some of these issues. That indexed value does include some elements of jobs by wage. However, we haven't included that in the 25% job share that is, I imagine, being referred to here.
Okay, so let's go back to the, yes.
Thank you. I was in Irvine. Thank you for being great hosts down there. I was in Irvine when we had the public hearing there, and I was amazed. I think there had to be, 60 or 70 people, maybe more than that. I can't remember. But it was pretty significant. You also mentioned here that we've always had input from local jurisdictions, but this time it has been not only local jurisdictions, but a lot of the public has been there. And that's what I noticed in Irvine. What do you attribute that to? Obviously, being a locally elected official, I'm seeing more engagement from the public in this arena. And I'm just wondering, are we getting out there? Are there people that are more concerned this time? What are kind of your feelings on that?
Well, I would hope more people are concerned because this is, in fact, if not one of the most important things we have to talk about. I mean, we typically talk about transportation and how to move people, but we find ourselves talking about housing because, in all honesty, it's, and I'm going to use that word again, my staff's tired of me saying this, it's an existential issue for us in this region. If we don't produce enough housing, we will begin to lose our economic vitality. We're just not doing enough. And so I think we're beginning to sense, a lot of people are beginning to sense that urgency more so this cycle than maybe in the past. And I don't necessarily, well, our staff's great and they've done a great job, and I would assume that some of their work has also attracted some attention maybe. But I think more than that is at every jurisdiction, housing has become a critical issue, maybe more so in some than others. Clearly the homelessness issue, and it's fortuitous that as we're talking about housing here today, in the room next door, they're talking about planning and trying to solve the homelessness issue. The fact that we're talking about that in both of these topics in SCAG at the same time, I think highlights the importance and the criticality of the issue. So I was hoping that we would actually have a lot more. I suspect I thought we would have a lot more people here today. I'm really impressed with the 167 that are still hanging with us online. So I mean, naturally, I don't know how it was in the FIT cycle. I wasn't here, but I doubt that you had the level of public meetings that we had. You only had one public meeting, and we probably had, I don't know, a couple dozen people at the public meeting, and that was it. And that was at the time when the crisis was actually beginning to peak for us. We're beginning to see the pathologies of that peak today more so, and that's why people are reacting to it. So I'm just feeling like we don't have enough people excited about this as I would hope we would, because we need to solve this together.
Well, I'm sorry, I just wanted to kind of follow up with that, Comey. I think those people will get excited when they start seeing, upzoning and going on in their communities. But okay, so it's a really complex issue. And unless you study it seriously, Mayan, your dinner table conversations must be fascinating. But I guess I just came from the Central Valley yesterday. I was up there for the Naval Air Show with the Blue Angels up there, and it's such a beautiful part of the state. What is the state doing to encourage growth in areas that are really, there's so much vacant land, and granted, I know we're an agricultural state, but there's so much room for growth, and literally they are begging people to move into areas up there. What is the state doing instead of packing more people here into LA? What's the state doing to encourage growth up there? I mean, somebody's got to be thinking about this. I'm clearly not the most brilliant person, but what are they doing to get this thing rolling in other parts of the state?
Thanks, Margaret. Certainly, I think as most of us know, I think the Central Valley is the highest growing region of the entire state. I think as we speak, and certainly that's a question we will certainly also ask the state agencies. So with that, if I may, I would like to go back to the regional offices for the last time, I think, in terms of any questions you might have. So Palmdale, I think, any questions?
Not at this time.
Okay, Imperial office?
No, none here, thanks.
Okay, thanks. CVAC office?
None.
Okay, Riverside office?
None.
Okay, San Bernardino office?
This is Josh again. So I guess my main point is that, thanks for including the jobs housing element in the existing portion of it, but without really touching the calculation, the projected need portion, I think the numbers are going to come out pretty much the same as what we had in option one. So looking forward to the toolkit to kind of compare the two. But I feel like without touching the projected need portion, it really doesn't change much in terms of numbers for our jurisdictions.
Josh, this is Kevin here again. I think I perhaps maybe can provide a little bit more of kind of the rationale or elaborate on that. It's not explicitly added there as a factor as it is in the existing need component. We've got to remember that a lot of these data points do work at similar purposes. You can see in the map that was in the presentation, that there's just a lot of similarity, for example, between the job access map and the HQTA map. These are various ways of kind of moving things a little bit more toward core or dense areas, or moving them less toward core or dense areas. So you do have a lot of replication in that regard. In addition to that, I would kind of point towards some of the other Connect SoCal strategies that relate specifically to jobs housing balance. Now, one of the shortcomings of RHNA is that it's only on the housing side, and this is the point that the last comment brought up as well. So our overall regional vision includes a balance between population, employment, and households. So there are elements such as a job centers strategy, which is totally separate from what we're presenting here, that are a component of the projected growth element already that do speak to that same effect. So you don't see it explicitly reflected there, but it is kind of reflected in a number of different ways, and a lot of these data points do achieve similar objectives overall.
Okay, Danny. Danny, please open. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
So when I was looking at the fifth site, I'm sorry, I'm Denny Zane, Executive Director of Move LA. Once upon a time, a council member in Santa Monica, where I spent a lot of time working on housing. And when I look at the fifth cycle data, which is roughly half the cycle, one of the things that's most noticeable, and I think the text from SCAG staff indicates this, is that the region's performance has actually surpassed its market rate development projections. In fact, we passed the total cycle when we were only halfway through the cycle on market rate, correct? It's like 173,000 units permitted, and and the total allocation for above moderate was 171,000, and we're about halfway through the cycle.
That's correct.
And so, assuming things continue, we will double the market rate portion of that cycle. Is that correct?
The number given by HCD, the regional determination, is noticeably higher than prior cycles. So we can't predict the future of what will be built, but you can probably draw conclusions.
Are you talking about doubling the fifth cycle?
No, I'm talking about in the fifth cycle, when we finish, at the same rate, we will have permitted/built twice the market rate units as projected previously, projected for that cycle, right? So it's not really underperforming, it's overperforming on the market rate side. However, on the affordable side, we are about 15% of the total, right? So maybe we get to a third, all things being fortunate, I guess. Most cities that do the affordable housing, who actually meet targets and what have you, do so with either public money and inclusionary strategies or the like. And this was a period, of course, no redevelopment money most of the time, et cetera, real lack of public money. So my question is, in terms of at least anticipating, and whatever the number is, anticipating an implementation strategy, don't we need to make a clarion call for multiple opportunities, local, county, state, for new resources for building affordable housing? If we're not doing that, then it's a joke. We're not actually going to meet any numbers on affordability, unless you're presuming that lots of markets somehow magically creates affordable, right? So when do we get the clarion call?
Okay, I'm assuming that's the question.
That was the question.
Yeah, so I think your point is well made. We had recognized very quickly, and in fact, we had our executive committee retreat meeting in August focused solely on housing. And I think, and some of my executive committee members are here and they can speak to it. Without question, I think what came out of that is that exact clarion call to begin to look for ways to work with Sacramento to enable cities to have the capacity to actually subsidize housing, because that's where we need to be to get affordable housing. Without redevelopment, a lot of our cities lost that edge a little bit. We were fortunate to see put in place an EIFD in Orange County with Placentia. That's an example. I think that's going to lead to about 600 units around a Metrolink station. That's an example that we want to replicate, but it's a very difficult tool to establish. So we're looking forward to being able to lead the charge on getting more capacity available to our cities and counties to be able to do exactly what you're talking about. So that clarion call is in works. We've been talking about it. I think the staging of it, you probably will see in what we're calling Beyond RHNA. And Sarah and her staff are already working while we're working on RHNA 24/7. I think there's another crew that's might be only Sarah. Maybe she's the only crew that's spending some time working on this housing program that I think we're going to evolve at SCAG to help. We're not going to be building houses, but we're going to be looking to set ourselves up to help our jurisdictions have the capacity to actually build the houses that are going to be planned for. So yes, there is a recognition of that need to enable cities to actually build the houses or help build the houses.
Especially the part they're not doing.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think anybody needs help building above moderate. I don't think we need to spend too much time there. It's workforce housing, affordable housing. That's where we want to spend time, and to the extent that we can create some more supply there, hopefully, and I'm not an economist, hopefully we begin to bend the curve on affordability in Southern California.
Okay, I think Gloria, do you think you have a question?
Hi, Gloria Oland. I work with Denny, and I'm going to ask his question again, but slightly differently. I mean, it obviously makes so much sense to direct more housing to high-resourced areas, but it also seems to me that it's much more expensive to build affordable housing in those high-resourced areas. I mean, it makes total sense to do that, to make it possible for lower-income people to live in high-resourced areas, but I mean, it seems to me that this is also creating a very big responsibility for us to find resources to build that housing.
Okay, thanks. So I think
I'll just mention on that, because I think don't forget that every single jurisdiction is going to max out their 2024 capacity. So it's not like the low resource areas are not building. We're talking about what happens ultimately with the large number we have is every single jurisdiction is going to be on task to try and build more than they've anticipated they would need to build in the past. And that's just the way it is. I think that's the summary of the conversation we're having.
Thanks, Comey. Any other questions? Last call for everybody, and in the Los Angeles office, and the video conferencing sites. So Ventura office, is there a question?
No questions here. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So with that, before I give back to, okay, Matt, okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, Matt Glesney, City Planning. Just kind of back to Pablo's original point, 2/3 now being basically through this, through the Connect SoCal, which can be influenced heavily by local input. And I mean, I appreciate the reasons for local input. We like local input as a concept, but we have seen it abused. I don't think there's any question that process has been non-transparent, has allowed cities to take a number of projected growth and modify it with little to no oversight to reduce the number and produce a housing number that they think it makes sense to them, but may not have any rational sense, may not meet our regional objectives, may not meet the objectives of RHNA. So I'm asking again, I asked earlier about transparency through the local input process, and if there's been any further conversation about that. How can we ensure that the local input process is not abused and is not just a mechanism for cities to pick a number that they like to lower their RHNA? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Well, so I'm just going to say, I would hope that there's no city out there that's trying to game it. I mean, that's one.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, that'd be nice. I mean, they all are elected. They're led by elected folks that should have some integrity. And we feel like city planning staff mostly have integrity. I hope people think we have integrity. If we lose our trust for the planning basis that's going around the region, we cannot make the numbers up for cities. We're not allowed to. Each city by state law should develop a general plan. And that general plan is based on some confirmed, well-accepted data. Now, I understand the concern. I'm not being naive, Matt, so don't get me wrong. I understand the concern, but I think we all have to continue to talk about it, just like you're saying, that we make sure that what we get out of the local input process, which is partly what we do, is to verify the number and ground truth the number and make sure that it tacks to some other verifiable data sets to the point that we're comfortable with it. Now, I would imagine the next cycle, it's kind of interesting, we're not done with 2020 plan, we're now going to start talking about 2024. The next cycle, obviously the local input process is going to be very, very scrutinized. And so the transparency you're talking about will probably be enhanced such that everybody will be able to prove that their number is not ginned up or held down inappropriately. So my response to your comment is, I understand that there might be the potential that some jurisdictions might be playing around with their numbers and local input process. We have to be able to take a number that a city council has voted on, that's gone through a public process. We have to be able to trust that number in some respect. And where we don't trust the number, hopefully we will be able to speak up and say why. But we can't just do that capriciously and say, we don't think your number is right, when in fact it's gone through a public process and it's gone through a vote of a city council. I mean, there has to be some respect for that kind of local authority and integrity. So that's where I come off of this. It's not to suggest that the information you get from every single jurisdiction is perfect, but there's some level of professional integrity and trust that I think we share across the region. And I, having worked across the state, I have to say that I feel like the process at the SCAG level is probably second to none in terms of having such a bottoms-up approach to planning. You never want to have SCAG be the one to determine what the jurisdiction's local data or planning basis will be. However, we have a responsibility, and I'll close on this, we have a responsibility to put that regional perspective on things, because that's the essence of our role, is to now take all of the basic information that comes from the jurisdictions and try to figure out how we grow together as a region to the extent that we meet all the various goals that are out there for us to meet, to make this a livable region for us. So I take very seriously your concern, because I don't think it's said lightly, and I don't think it's even misplaced. I think it's real, but I'm just giving you where we're coming at this.
Transparency is what we want to. We're just asking for be able to see the difference in those numbers and how they come to the city, back from the city. I think would be tremendously helpful to ensure. It'd be great. Next cycles be better, but this cycle, I think we could still ask for some transparency.
Thanks, Matt. So we are reaching the end of the session. Just to remind everybody, the next step is the October 7th, the RHNA subcommittee meeting. That will also include the video conferencing and view-only webcast. And early next week, that we will post the staff report as well as the tool. And we actually are not able to get all the questions from the web. So we will certainly respond to those questions. And for all participants, I think after today, if you have any questions or comments, and feel free to send to housing@scag.ca.gov.
No, I'm just, I guess I kind of feel like you do, and that is, I wish we'd had a little bit more of the public involved here today. But certainly you've had good input with regard to the different meetings that we had out there. So I'm grateful for that. And I absolutely believe transparency is important. And I appreciate your bringing that up. And we'll make sure that all of the cities follow through on that. It's like I said, I believe transparency is critical. I think the public wants it. They also want to be included in the process, which means more local input, because I am responsive to the people that elect me to office. So thank you. Appreciate the staff work. Again, you all are amazing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody.